Hey guys, this is Kat, and I am here with co-host Anna. And on this episode of Setting the Pace, we are going to dive in to learn more about Anna, her background, and some of the absolutely incredible innovations that she's leading in women's health. Women's health is always a fun topic to talk about. Sometimes it's difficult. And, we're going to hit all the angles in this podcast. So I'm just going to jump right in and turn it over to you, Anna. You have really become a strong advocate in women's healthcare, and I think we're really just at the cusp of what can come from your company and all of the stuff that you're doing. I would really like you to focus on this area of research that is very important, and something from relative research background, master's in writing a thesis. We're taught to create cohorts in a certain way, and we're taught to have like a robust data set. But you have a very interesting perspective on a different way that we should be looking at research and data. So can you dive in and tell us a little bit more about you and this movement that you're creating?
Yeah, thank you. So thanks for setting the stage in terms of really what I consider the buildup to LifeStory Health. And that's all about sex-specific testing and the lack thereof, and what we're doing as a company, but also sort of the pain points that we've identified in that industry. And so from a research perspective, as Kat alluded to, a lot of the clinical research, the scientific research that goes on, the cohort is mainly male, whether it's male lab rats or male participants. And so we can go into a little bit more on that. First, a little bit about me. So I'm the founder and CEO of LifeStory Health. And my story began, I was actually diagnosed with early stage cancer, and what brought me into the doctor's office was irregular bleeding. And just like you'll hear probably throughout our podcasts, everybody has gone to the doctors as a female and for some pretty irregular things, and the physicians haven't known how to deal with it. And so for me, it took me about 6 months of finding different physicians and being turned away for stress for the irregular bleeding, which it ended up being cancer. And so that's really what led me to create LifeStory Health. Was, first of all, the question was, well, why can't you use this blood source to diagnose disease? And I started asking the question, and no one really knew. And then I started doing the research, and there was, a few here and there. Maybe in China, there's a couple that were looking at menstrual blood, but it was on a very scientific hypothesis level, what if? But it wasn't really creating a solution for female patients. And within that research, I also noticed that there was a major lack of sex-specific testing, meaning that females were largely underrepresented in clinical studies, but they were also underrepresented in scientific studies, like with animals, and for diseases that primarily affected women. So to me, those things didn't add up. And from a historical perspective, there's good reason for it. A lot of the male participants in clinical studies in the 1950s were medical students, which in the 1950s, men were mostly medical students. And so you can look at it and you can make excuses along the way, but that doesn't refute the fact that we still need more sex-specific testing. And so I'll kind of go in over this podcast on some of the big statistics that I think shock people and get women motivated to want to do more, so that they're not going to the physician and it's the same recourse over and over. So when we look at sex-specific testing, and if you run a quick Google search on it, you're going to find that almost every organ system in the body has sex differences with it. Pharmacokinetically is a huge thing. Women have different liver enzymes, meaning that they are going to metabolize drugs at different rates than men. So you can have a 200-pound woman and a 120-pound man, and that doesn't mean that they're going to metabolize drugs differently just because, their weight is different, their size is different. Women are actually biologically different. And so that's sort of what led me to start LifeStory Health. And I'll let you ask some more questions because I know that you probably have a lot.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. Yes, focusing on sex-specific research is, so many things come to mind. But first of all, the insight that you were able to glean from the fact that despite what we're told in, master's or PhD or anytime you're doing a research project, which is you're supposed to have a balanced cohort. The fact that you found that wasn't balanced is astonishing. And I think that in and of itself provides a call to action for research. And then moving to the side, taking a layman's perspective of, when you told me the first time that you were focusing on sex-specific research, my non-research brain said, absolutely, that makes great sense. We talk all the time about women in leadership and trying to close that diversity gap, both in leadership and technology. But in research, that conversation hasn't happened yet. And, you're leading that. And I can imagine that speaking to researchers and saying, encouraging sex-specific research might be a very difficult topic. How have your conversations gone so far in terms of with researchers, associations, nonprofits that may exist? What's the conversation like so far?
Yeah, so the conversation is shifting for sex-specific testing because patient advocacy groups are starting to come forward, and patients as well, that there is a need for it. But I can tell you some of my early conversations with researchers is first of all, I could tenure any professor in the world with this research because there is so much to be done. And part of the hardship that I initially had with the company was that this isn't a research project. There's a lot of research that needs to be done, but we also need to provide solutions that directly impact the patients because it could stay in the lab forever. One of the big things that researchers, the reason they don't look at females is because of their hormone cycles. Really, and that extends way beyond researchers, but that extends into clinical studies and pharmaceutical companies because you want to limit your variables. Mm-hmm. And hormone cycles, risk of pregnancy, there's a lot of things that can pull women out of clinical studies. And so by looking at sex-specific research and females directly, we actually embrace that estrogen production from the ovaries. And there is a lot of literature based on the cyclical nature of menstruation in combination with estrogen and estrogen signaling pathways with female prevalent disease. And there's the biggest research so far has been on ovarian cancer. There is a lot of similarities between the estrogen regulated pathways in ovarian cancer to the same pathways that are in endometrial and breast cancer, which proves the point that the ovaries can impact disease well beyond the reproductive system. And we have proven that firsthand with our data. In fact, all of the data leading diseases that we have followed are actually outside of the reproductive system other than endometrial cancer. And so we are a big proponent of, and in a later podcast, we've also spoken about traumatic brain injury and neurological disorders. But there is significant research that neurological disorders and estrogen production are related, which kind of brings me into a big feat in women's health, which happened in May, which the FDA approved the first ever migraine prevention drug. And that was the big deal for women's health for the reason that 3 times as many women will suffer migraines than men. And so it was actually... It took away part of what the medical society have always thought about migraines, which is that it was neurological, but it was also largely psychological. And so, not to get too feminist or sex-specific, female advocacy, but for the most part, the pain that women realized from migraines wasn't significant enough to create some research on just that and the biological pathways that affected it. And so that was a really big deal for women's health that just came recently. So that's back to the conversation is starting to shift. And we as a company have an affiliation with the Women's Brain Project, which is a organization only on sex-specific testing. So they only look at Alzheimer's and neurological disorders from the female perspective, which is truly fascinating.
That's absolutely incredible. I have a really good friend who suffers from migraines, and she has seen so many physicians, and they've never been able to specifically identify what her triggers are. They've tried food, they've tried diet, they've tried sleep and stress. And I remember seeing a commercial for that particular prescription, and I texted her right away, and I said, I don't know if this is for you. I'm sure you've heard of it already, but perhaps this can help you. And it just kind of speaks to the struggle that sometimes women can have trying to seek help. And I think the work that you're doing is absolutely incredible, and you really are setting the pace in terms of analytics. So can you speak to how your company, LifeStory Health, is accelerating women's health research?
Yes, absolutely. So LifeStory Health has discovered biomarkers found in a source that has, for the last 2,000 years, been considered medical waste. And so we look at menstrual blood. The things to note about what we have found in menstrual blood is that we have found unique signatures. So we look at protein in that blood source, and we have been able to find the uniqueness of them outside of circulating blood of the same patient, but also circulating blood of both male and female, as well as purified protein, meaning we've ordered protein from a lab that doesn't contain the unique signatures that we're looking at. And so we have found that there is something very unique to menstrual blood, and we're using that to look at either prediction or early diagnosis of disease. And so in terms of accelerating healthcare, I have to say that women in and of themselves are accelerating healthcare. So they're 51% of the population. They're a very savvy consumer market. So 80% of all household healthcare decisions are made by women. And women go to their primary care physicians way over men. And so they do place a priority on their healthcare. And so by embracing the sex differences, I actually think it just turns into good business. We're also streamlining advancements within the industry. So a lot of what we're doing is just taking a blood source that has not been looked at previously and using FDA-approved technology to create novel diagnostics in order to diagnose more predictive, earlier, and more precise. And so a lot of the research that we have found applies precision medicine principles to women's health because we have a group of selection biomarkers that we've used to categorize women within women. And so the precision medicine approach, we hope, will tailor more diagnostics, but also potential therapeutic targets to impact more patients. And the last acceleration is we are using a blood source that is non-invasive, readily available, and allows for monthly tracking. And it can all be done from home. And just, I get a lot of questions about how that works. And we use FDA-approved technology to take a dried blood spot, and then it's mailed to the lab. It's FDA-approved for the male, and then we reconstitute it in the lab. So in terms of, I can't think of any better way to accelerate and streamline resources when you don't even have to schedule a doctor's appointment, a blood draw, and it's really very easy for us. And what that means, though, for accelerating healthcare is it also allows other resources to be used more wisely. So, and we can go into some of the things that we're doing, but the big thing there is even just oncology resources.
Tell me more about that.
So I'll kind of go through what the company has found and where we're looking for the next, 3 years as our outlook. We're always focused on early detection or predetermination. So the biomarkers that we discovered have unique protein signatures. I've already expressed that they're unique to circulating blood in both male and female. But what we did is we led the first discovery into the clinical utility of menstrual blood. And so when I talk about oncology resources, our 2016 proof of principle, we had over 400 women from around the country participate in our clinical study. They all gave multiple months worth of menstrual blood samples, and what we were able to do with that is identify unique signatures to the proteins. And then we took the top most abundant proteins that we found that had unique signatures and put them into our first, what we want to do with clinical studies is look at actually how that impacts disease. And surprisingly, the first 11 proteins all have to do with cancer. And so when we look at oncology, we're about to start in 2019 3 cancer studies that will look at early stage cancer patients compared to the control in lung cancer, endometrial, and breast cancer. And uniquely, 2 of those are outside of the reproductive system. And one just kind of to tie in some of the sex-specific testing there is 3 times as many non-smoking women will get lung cancer versus non-smoking men. And so studies have suggested that if gender roles in cancer prevalence were better understood, that almost a third of cancers could be caught earlier or cured. And so that's just a good example of our research being incredibly innovative, but also falling in line with a lot of the research that's saying, hey, there's something up here, but we're not quite sure what. And as a company, we think that menstrual blood may provide some of the insights.
So fascinating. And so you mentioned oncology, and I think back to the story that you opened up with your own personal experience. When you started to dig into the data, did you anticipate finding a correlation? Were you searching for it, or it just, like you said, the top proteins happen to have that connection to cancer? It just seems so serendipitous.
Yeah, and exactly that's what it is. And so we asked you at one point why people say, why hasn't this been done before? And that's the exact thing, is the best word is serendipitous for this. We have a mantra as a company to let the data lead. And one of the reasons why I think we have found what we have found is because of that reason, and also our steadfast approach in not searching for something.
Mm-hmm.
And so the obvious things to search for are, where are these pain points in women's health? And when I look at it, I see a pain point in women's health as all of women's health, and that goes back to the sex-specific testing. So no, we did not look for it, and we actually, the very first thing that we stumbled upon with unique signatures was we thought it might be indicative of diabetes, and we've done some more research on it, and it's been put into a pipeline for our selection biomarkers, which we're using to classify women on overall health status. And so we'll be doing some clinical studies on our selection biomarkers and seeing how they work against different therapeutic targets. And then the other biomarkers that we found were really just the ones that contained the most unique signatures. And now we need to see how disease correlates with that from the actual early stage patients themselves.
Have you reconnected with any of your physicians that you met prior to your diagnosis and shared what you're working on?
I have a little bit. That goes back to that point where you're telling your physician, as you were saying, as a researcher, you're kind of telling them that they're not necessarily wrong, but they may have not uncovered a rock or a boulder. And so I haven't yet, and part of, as a company, what we aim to do is we want to work with the physicians, because this isn't a femtech product. Yeah. It will be, a prescribed diagnostic is what we hope for it to be. So we want to work with the physicians, but we're waiting for some more data to come in before we really start to have those conversations.
And that really parallels with what you said, though, which is letting data lead. So in that situation, you would let data lead that conversation, which all the physicians that I've come across with are they're trained in data, they're trained in research, and I feel like that would be a conversation that is more approachable than a subjective conversation, if you will. Like, this was my personal experience. Yeah, it's like more about like, no, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
This is what the data says.
Which has been the hardest part, and that brings me to the hardest part of this company has been just that. It's like, it started off, for lack of better words, on a paper napkin with me saying, here's what I think we can do. And then we had this, big 2016 proof of principle study that we got results in October for. So almost a year and a half later. So we are at a point now that we've never been in where we do have the data and we can say, hey, we have found something. And that has significantly helped conversations with researchers. And right now we really are still in a research phase. And so I can tell you, though, the conversation with researchers has been very positive, and they're very excited about the potential of this.
That's fantastic. I just want to touch on this point, going back to how patients can submit their data to you through the mail. And it's fascinating seeing this new part of healthcare evolve. So I think we saw it first with glasses, with Warby Parker. So you can do all of your glasses online now. There's now a contact subscription. Then they came out with the Invisalign, but through the mail. I've now recently seen colon cancer screening through mail. And then I just think you have approached it in a very practical, realistic way for a topic that's difficult to talk about. And it's very approachable. So was that a natural idea to you to utilize something that was feeling safe to the patient?
Yeah, so you've said it better than I have, but it really started with the first question I asked myself 4 years ago was, will women do this? And from there, it led to being the approved through the mail, because we did a focus group of hundreds of women just on the usability. And you can't schedule a doctor's appointment around your menstrual cycle. Like, it would be nearly impossible, because you're never going to bleed the moment you think you're going to bleed. And so some by just sheer functionality, we had to do it from home. But you're right, it has led to kind of a safe place to do that. It's private. The fact of menstruation is private and intimate. But I think part of, too, like why it's so comfortable is I can say menstrual blood in a room full of people, mostly men, and not shy away from it. And I think that confidence has also helped. And the more women talk about what they're going through, and you've said it with the friend that had the migraines, you would have never been able to turn her on to a new migraine medication if she hadn't talked about it. Mm-hmm. And so part of it is also just getting women to talk about menstrual blood. And so that's part of our initiative as a company, is to talk more about sex-specific research and to say menstrual blood as many times in a conversation as I possibly can. So hopefully we can go back through this 25-minute podcast and see how many I've said.
I love it. It's always, it's fun to have conversations that make some people a little bit uneasy. I think that also brings about a very great and strong conversation too. So to close out, in your perfect world, where will your company be in the next 10 years?
So just going back to the ease of collection, globally we have huge potential. And so in a perfect world, every OBGYN, primary care, oncologist would be able to utilize our technology, not just in the US, but globally. What we strive to do is provide physicians and patients with a simplified approach to disease care. Now, we're starting with oncology and streamlining those medical resources, but the fact that we can impact over half of the population is really incredible, and we hope that in 10 years we are on a strong line of doing that, not just in oncology, but in all female prevalent disease across the world.
That's fantastic. And when we are at that point, everybody will look to you and say that you really set the pace, and why didn't this exist before? So this was fascinating. I am so glad that we took the time to get to know you more and learn more about what you're doing, and can't wait to see how it continues to go as we move on as co-hosts of this podcast. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Kat.